Hello, I'm here with Dr. Steven Hassan PhD, who is an expert in mind control, cults, and everything that deals with how we think and how we don't think for ourselves. We're talking specifically about banned books week because that really, in my opinion, is a form of attempted mind control. Tell us a little bit of your story, and you and I have something in common. We were both in the Moonies in our early 20s, which you're not public about. I'm only limitedly in public about that, but it's right in my book. So talk a little bit how you gain control over your own mind.
Sure. Well, first of all, I grew up in Flushing, Queens, New York, 1.3 miles from Donald Trump's birth and childhood home, I should say, and pretty normal childhood, youngest of three kids, middle class, extra honors student, and I was basically at college, at Queens College. My girlfriend had dumped me abruptly. I was sitting in the student cafeteria, and three moony women, love bombed me and flirted with
Oh,
me and lied and said they were students and lied and said
yeah.
they weren't part of a religious group. But I went down this radicalization rabbit hole. This was February of 1974 at age 19 and emerged 2.5 years later after a near fatal van crash due to sleep deprivation, and was so banged up that I was of no use to the group as I was recovering, needed surgery, and agreed to see my sister Thea, the only person in my family that didn't say I was in a cult and I was brainwashed. And she persuaded me to come visit her because I had a nephew. She appealed to my unclehood and said, I want your nephew to know his Uncle Stevie, which was how she referred to me and when we were kids. And that led to a deprogramming, first involuntarily, and then on the second day, my father cried and asked me how I would feel if my son disappeared, dropped out of college, got involved with a controversial group. And I thought for the first time from his perspective, I would be pretty worried too. And as a Moonie, I thought, oh, he's brainwashed by the communist media against
Yeah.
God. So I was very fanatical. I was made a assistant director of the Unification Church in Queens, and then assistant director at the national headquarters. I was held up by Moon personally as the model member. So I was pretty darn fanatical. But this deprogramming, I wanted to prove to my family I wasn't brainwashed and I wasn't in a cult. So I agreed to meet for 4 days with ex-Moonies in order to demonstrate that I was thinking for myself. The only thing was that I started thinking for myself.
Yes.
In particular, I had, and in the Moonies, when you recruit people, it's referred to as spiritual children. And as a cult recruiter, I was pretty successful. I had 13 direct spiritual children. And one of them was part of the deprogramming team, a lovely woman named Gladys Gonzalez, who became a social worker after she left, was there, and I knew she was a sweetheart. And in any case, learning about Chinese communist brainwashing, meeting with ex-members who were asking me questions. By the final day, I realized Moon was a liar, and if he was a liar, that meant he wasn't a representative of God, because the Moonies teach that God is a God of truth, even though they teach members to lie all the time.
Heavily
So that,
deceptive, it's called.
yeah,
Yes.
heavenly deception. The important thing is that the bubble burst, and my what I realized was that all of my beliefs were based on the presupposition that Moon was the Messiah and was going to save the world. And once I realized he wasn't the Messiah and he was not trustworthy and he was a liar, I just wept for hours and just I was crushed. I was so upset. And part of my therapy was reading books on brainwashing and mind control, in particular Robert J. Lifton's work and Edgar Schein's Coercive Persuasion. And by the way, I just interviewed Lifton. He's 98 years old now. I just posted a YouTube video. I interviewed him about Trump. I'm just posted it now. But he more or less changed my life because I had read his book. I called him up. I asked to meet with him. And he more or less listened to my tale about how the Moonies recruited me and how I recruited other people. And he said, you know, I just studied this secondhand, but you've lived this. They did it to you and you did it to other people. And what you're describing is so much more sophisticated than what the Chinese were doing in the 50s. You should study psychology and explain it to people like me. And there I was, a 22-year-old college dropout with a cast from my toes to my groin. My other leg was all bandaged up in crutches, and this Yale psychiatrist was telling me I had something valuable to teach him. So I switched majors from creative writing to psychology, later became a licensed mental health professional. I've since gotten a second master's and did my doctorate because I realized I want to change the law itself and end this nonsense that there's a slippery slope and one person's mind control is another person's religion. I have a model that pretty much defines what's a healthy religion and what's an authoritarian mind control cult.
Yeah.
My first book came out in 1988 called Combating Cult Mind Control and on the subject of banned books. Cults were stealing my book out of libraries and out of bookstores so people couldn't get it and read it. That was back in and when it came out in 1988 and 89. And I've been pretty much censored by many places. My story about the cult of Trump when that book came out, a Simon and Schuster publisher, I was on CNN, Reliable Sources with Brian Stelter, and the Tennessee legislature passed a bill saying CNN was fake news because they interviewed me saying that Trump was a cult leader.
Yeah.
And while they didn't ban the book explicitly, they pretty much tarred me as and the Trump always does the standard cult leader 101 stuff of not taking responsibility for what he does and projecting it onto everyone else. So I became the cult figure. I'm in the cult of Soros and I'm a libtard and
Well,
all
we
of
are
the
Jewish, so we must be.
yeah. So I'm honored to be part of the Banned Books Week and just say that my book is really a disruptor to a lot of very powerful, wealthy organizations that don't want the public to understand brainwashing or mind control. So the important thing is that people who care about freedom and rights and people thinking for themselves love my work and support it, my Freedom of Mind website, etc. And authoritarian cults and groups like the CIA and other state intelligence organizations want to keep the public ignorant and not
Compliant.
reveal the facts that minds can be hacked and that state intelligence actors are often proxy groups to do their deeds, whether it's violence or infiltration, etc. And the Moonies were one of these projects. And before I stop talking, I'll just add the Moonies own the Washington Times, which I interviewed a author named David Lipsky who wrote The Parrot and the Igloo on climate science denial and
Yeah.
outed the Moonies as the single biggest purveyor of disinformation about climate science.
Yeah, well,
Hired,
not just Washington Post. They also own United Press International, which used to be highly esteemed.
yes, and Mrs. Moon gave Donald Trump $2.5 million to endorse her movement a few weeks after January 6th. So
Wow.
when I tell people I was in the Moonies and I was in the room when Moon talked about infiltrating the US government and how democracy was satanic and we need to have a theocracy, and how we have to change the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people who violate the Moonies rules on sexuality. This is 50 years ago, and I've been
Oh,
warning people ever since. And now we're living in in the age where we're close to these long-term plans getting implemented. So
yeah, that's probably what scares me. That's the reason I wrote my book. And that's the
yes,
reason why we're talking, because I'm really convinced that if people can really get, we talked about this when we talked last week, if people really understand critical thinking and really learn the basics of logic, because that's no longer taught in schools anymore, which in my opinion leaves us very vulnerable. And if we would really gain the emotional intelligence and emotional literacy, we're going to be less easily manipulated. But right
I
now,
think
I feel
it's
like we're just being bounced around like a yo-yo on a string because we're not, it's not that we're stupid. Actually, the most intelligent people tend to be the ones who join cults.
yeah, idealistic people who want to improve
Idealistic, yeah,
themselves. They
high
want to
moral
make the world
values.
better.
Yeah, the people that are very selfish aren't going to be drawn to any kind of group that is proclaiming we have a way to make the world better.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
so the people who are doing the book banning, the tricky thing is in their mind, they're doing God's work.
Hmm.
Or whoever is their deity, they're doing divine
Or they
sacred work.
believe it's God, but I don't
Yeah.
believe it's God,
So the
obviously.
tricky part is talk about the mentality of the people that are pushing the book banning in ways that we can get through to shift that behavior.
Yeah, so the for me, Judah, teaching my influence continuum, I'll just hold up a graphic, but it's on my website. People can go to
Yeah.
freedomofmind.com, learn and download this. The unethical influence, understanding the bite model, which is my model of behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control, creating a pseudo identity that's dependent and obedient on an external authority figure or institution or ideology. So
Yes.
for me, the teaching this model that this is about informed consent, conscience, critical thinking, free will, decision making, access to information, healthy leadership, healthy organizations that are transparent and accountable. And this is the stereotypical profile of the malignant narcissist leader who thinks he's above the law, and pathological lying and dogma and doctrine and obedience. So teaching this model, it gives people a lot of tools to do this evaluation. And one of the areas of thought control under the bite model is this simplistic ideology of us versus them, good versus evil, black and white. We're God, they're Satan. And what doesn't work is attacking the leader, the doctrine, or the policy head on. But
That
what
just gets
does work is talking about Chinese communist brainwashing, because they'll listen to that. And then we can get into the bite model and the influence continuum, or talking about pimps and traffickers, because most MAGA people are against both of these, or predators and predatory organizations. So the idea is to teach through case example and then ask questions that prod the person to reflect on their own experience. Ask them to go back in time before they met this guy named Trump. And what would they think of entering into a business relationship with a man who was a criminal? and a pathological liar? Or would they consider marrying someone who is a criminal and a pathological liar? People say, of course not. And then, but the point is not to talk down to believers, but warmly. And as a former member, I used my status and just say, like, I got lied to and was following this fat Korean billionaire thinking he was 10 times greater than Jesus Christ. And I was told as a Moonie leader that when the Moonies took over, we would abolish all other religions, including yours.
Yeah.
You know, and that gets their attention. Really? And it's like, really? So the idea is to encourage questioning because in the end, people exit themselves when they have the proper information and tools, and they have an exit ramp where they're not going to feel like they're jumping off a cliff, but where they're joining millions and millions of other Americans who are exiting all types of cults.
I can see that working on a one-to-one basis. How can you apply that principle in the case of the school board meeting or the library commission when they're caving into this pressure? What are some things that can be done in those situations that people realize, those decision makers can see how they're falling under undue influence?
In the end, I think that people need to be taught basic social psychology. Solomon Asch in the 50s created this visual perception experiment, only it wasn't. It was a conformity experiment. And he would have somebody in the front of the room with a series of placards with a sample size line and three lines of varying lengths. And there would be a circle of participants, and but there was always one person who was the actual subject of the experiment, and they would go around twice giving the correct answer, and then they would all, with certainty, give the wrong answer. So they would say a 3-inch line was a 2-inch line. And what Solomon Asch wanted to see is how many people, despite their own eyes, their
Go
evidence
along.
of their own experience, would start caving and give in to the group. And the magic number was 2/3 would start to cave. I often show a Dateline episode where they show three people. One is what's called a heroic resistor, this woman who gives the correct answer despite everyone else's certainty. Her face is grimacing and her voice is getting quieter and quieter, but she sticks to her guns.
Yeah.
Then another guy who caves after a few correct answers, and he just gets sullen and
Because there's
quieter,
no,
like
he's not being true to himself. Yeah.
he wasn't being true to himself. And then one guy who became a true believer, who was emphatically agreeing with the wrong answer. But the interesting thing was, after it was over, they interviewed each person. The woman who was the heroic resistor was beaming. Yes,
I stood up.
I didn't cave. And the other guy was like, yeah, I just kind of gave up and I wasn't playing the game right. And the other guy was like, I'm really, embarrassed. And the point, and getting back to the school board, for me, showing this video to them and talking about how we're social beings and we tend to cave to what is popular around us, even though we know and we can actually get up and measure what the correct answer is objectively. And we want to encourage people to be heroic resistors, to do the right thing, even though other people have been brainwashed or unduly
Right.
influenced.
I wholeheartedly support that. The challenge in practical terms, or maybe political terms, is that I've done a lot of local journalism in my life. And in covering school boards, I found that they want to tell you how you should be educated, but they're seldom, with wonderful exceptions, they're seldom willing to get educated themselves.
Yep. Encouraging a love of learning and is missing. And rote memorization for tests is just the wrong approach to education itself. I'm a big fan of an organizational psychologist named Adam Grant, who wrote a book called
Yes,
Think Again. And he celebrates people who separate their ego from their beliefs and just pursue a love of learning and
for the
are
sake of
happy to
learning.
change
Yes.
their mind if they can be shown evidence that what they were believing was incorrect.
So using your expertise in psychology, what's the way to persuade that school board or library board to sit down and watch a video like this?
Well, so my idea, and I've had zero success trying to get to any of the big organizations that are out trying to register voters and the Democrats, etc. But I really believe people could have little short videos on their cell phones and say, "Can I have 5 minutes of your time and I want your opinion on this." Show them a video and ask them their opinion on it. And depending on their reaction, if they do watch it, I would find it very hard to believe anyone would think a 3 inch line is a 2 inch line. And asking them what they think about people who would answer that a 3 inch line is a 2 inch line because everyone else in the room is saying it.
I got it.
And and I really believe in real life we're human beings. This whole digital environment that's developed in the last 30 years is foreign to the human experience. And ultimately, people are very anxious and lonely and depressed being online all the time. Real friends are in real life and not followers who are anonymous
Yeah.
and chasing numbers. So I
Well, how much of
really
that is just the fact that we're so insecure inside, we need that external validation, and it can come from any source.
and again, it's an issue of the people who are controlling, whether they're fossil fuel corporations like the Kochs or the Saudis or Putin, etc. They want the public to be distracted from the real issues of what
Yes.
civics should be about and what to do to put people in authority in politics who are actually going to serve the people and not the lobbyists.
Isn't that part of the psychology of that I want to be free, but you can't be?
And I really want to celebrate you as a former member of the Moonies who's dedicated your life to learning and growing and educating other people. And I think this is very important work. So thank you, Judah.
Thank you for that. Because I think deep down in our hearts, I never honestly believed I needed to feel acceptance. So I was hooked on the love. And when I finally got hip to that's what was going on with me, I realized that all the restrictions I'd put on my own freedom, and I am named freed, when I saw those restrictions, I walked away. And in the process of recovery, not only I developed the idea in my book of authority addiction, which you talked about last week, but also the idea of split perceptions, which I
Hmm.
think plays an important role in this. I'm going to try and breathe my way through this.
Yeah.
It's the idea that, if we tried hearing everything at once at the same time, the cacophony would drive us mad. So we naturally impose biological and sensory filters to only absorb what we can reasonably absorb.
Hmm.
The problem is we take that process and apply that emotionally. So we only see what we want to see, hear what we want to see, or hear what we want to hear. Those kinds of filters. And and the result of that, so we can start becoming blindsided by stuff we won't look at.
So for me, my framing that made sense for me to describe the experience was there was the real Steve Hassan and the Mooney Steve Hassan. And this Steve Hassan was, believed Moon and his wife were his true parents. So it's called a dissociative disorder in psychological terms. And so the E of the bite model is phobia indoctrination. In my experience, I wanted to ask you about this, Judah, but in my
Please.
experience, we were brought to see the Exorcist movie in New York. And then we went to Tarrytown, and Moon said, God made this movie, and it's a prophecy of what will happen if you leave the Unification
Oh,
Church.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
for
the same kind of
me,
prophecies. Yeah.
that was the moment where I was so petrified by what I had seen in the movie, and there was the Messiah saying God made the movie. Wasn't Hollywood, wasn't special effects and subliminal imagery of the devil. And so was taught to do thought stopping. That's a behavior modification technique where we were taught to chant true parents, glory to heaven, peace on earth, etc. Whenever we had a doubt or we had something that was deviating us from the mission of total submission to your able figure, your central figure. And so for me, it's this dual identity model. And later, Robert Lifton studied Nazi doctors, and he called it doubling, that the Nazi doctors would be loving
Language.
parents and, husbands and parents, and then go back and do these horrific experiments because it was part of their work identity.
That makes a lot of sense. The feeling that I have about that is it sort of comes back to this whole thing that if people are not emotionally grounded in who they are, they're prey to this kind of stuff.
And I'll say that we're biopsychosocial beings,
We are.
and being grounded, it means being in your body and listening to your body. And that's the opposite of having a dissociative disorder. And I say, be true to yourself and listen to your body. If you're having intuition that something's wrong, act on it. Take a time out. Go to another place. Go to a trusted uncle or sister or brother and sit and take a time out and do research.
I agree with that. And, I think, again, people oftentimes have the unwillingness to do the hard work of personal growth and, let alone do the hard work of social change. But, I'd love to assist them both together. But if
Sure.
people are more willing, to have the willingness to look inside themselves instead of just saying, "Ooh, look, the latest meme. Hey, I'll believe that."
Right.
So I sometimes think that what's happening on social media and what's happening around book banning, there's a common thread there. People listening to voices outside of themselves about what it is to be a good guy. Like I have this T-shirt. I thought of wearing it today, but I decided to wear my suit jacket instead. But it says, "Show me a society where it was the good guys who were banning books."
You never,
Yeah,
never. I have it under information control. Like if you're an intelligent, educated person, you can decide if a book is valuable or not, or there are elements of a book that make sense and there are others that don't make sense. But to have some external authority tell you you can't look at a book, it's too dangerous. That's not encouraging an internal locus of control where people can decide for themselves what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
I agree. Great, wonderful. But so, since this is a convention of the American Society of Journalists and Authors, these are people whose job it is informing the world of the facts as best they know them. So, what's some things that journalists can do to counter book banning
I
using
think
the
I
tools and
think
understanding that
that
you
I
have?
think this is a great question and a great opportunity. I'm going to advocate that people learn about brainwashing and mind control and not just say this is what Mussolini did or this is what Hitler did, but actually talk granularly about information control, thought control, emotional control, behavior control, and educate people about what's healthy, not just say what's wrong, but what's healthy. And developing perspective is the antidote to blind faith. developing the ability to hold different worldviews and understand them, but not it won't violate your own sense of self and your own values. And right now there's, aside from documentaries that are being done on cults that are like, I call it trauma porn. Look at what these people were made to do, but they're not explaining the nuts and bolts of
Also, how
how
it happened.
how
Yeah.
social psychology does this to people. I highly recommend my mentor, Philip Zimbardo of the Zimbardo Prison Study at
Yes.
Stanford. I highly recommend his Heroic Imagination Project. It's heroicimagination.org is the website. Little vignettes, videos of social psychology experiments with questions that anyone, a parent, a teacher, can, and it's a curriculum for school as well, encourage people to be doing the right thing, which is be the heroic resistor. Don't follow what everyone else is doing. And quick example, the bystander study. What is the bystander study? Well, two conditions. One is you're walking along by yourself and somebody collapses on the sidewalk in front of you. Almost everyone goes to help the person. Second condition, there are 30 people walking by, you're there, and someone collapses, and no one goes to help. Very few people go and
No,
help.
yeah.
And what he teaches is you want to not be a bystander. You want to put yourself in the person's shoes who collapsed. Would you want someone to call you help or see if you're okay? If the answer is yes, ignore what everyone else is doing. They're walking by and go help the person.
So how can working journalists do that in a practical way? Because we have editors, we have publishers we got to deal with, we got readers that love or hate what we do.
I'm for solution-based journalism where they're not just describing the problem, but giving specific solutions like study the influence continuum, the bite model, Zimbardo's heroic imagination project. Learn that it's okay to leave cults. There are people leaving MAGA at this moment, people leaving New Apostolic Reformation cults that comprise 30 to 40 million Americans, many of whom are book banning, I would add. Yeah.
So you'd encourage journalists to write more about this topic,
Yeah,
not just
educate themselves and share that knowledge with the public. We need educated citizens who are not walking around thinking it's only weak, stupid people who get into mind control
something. Yeah.
cults. They get deceived, and there's a whole set of social psychological mechanisms that go into somebody getting co-opted. And there's life after cults. There are millions of ex-members and they can do stories about former members and amplify their message.
Good. That's good. Any other things you would suggest for the journalists who are watching this?
I think the key is be true to yourself. Yes, you have editors, but you also need to tell the story. And if you're having trouble telling the proper story in the venue that you're working for, see if you can find an alternative way to get the message out that's actually going to make a difference.
That's good.
Thanks for
Thank you.
inviting
Bye
me,
bye.
buddy. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye
Bye.
bye.